What are you? These three words are common. They are determining factors in life. My initial response when I hear those words is not, I'm a student or I'm a girl. My response is always, I'm black. Why is race the initial response to this question? We live in a society where who you are determines your status in life. But even more so, the ugly truth is that your race is a precedent for what kind of person you will be. Many will argue that's not true. Racism isn't an issue anymore. Or we live in the 21st century. Nobody cares about race anymore. In fact, many people do. We live in a country that developed off of slavery, which is stemmed from racism. Although overshadowed, racism continues to be a major part of our society today. For at least 2 centuries, America's farms were tended by black slaves. These farms or plantations could house at least 100 slaves, given the size of the plantation property, a population the size of a small town. These slaves were nothing more than property, a tool to do all the hard work and receive no profit. Although slaves were given some food to live off of and a roof to cover their heads, in no way were they given fair treatment or seen the same way as other citizens who were not black. As slavery became abolished and the slaves learned of their emancipation 1 year after Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, slaves went off and started living their own life, free, a dream come true. But American slaves, blacks, were never seen the same. They were never seen as people. This fact continued on for generation after generation. People began to think lonely of not only black people and black culture, but also other races that were anything but white. How? Behaviors and thinking patterns are not embedded into the mind. The prejudiced way of thinking was learned, taught, and passed on. The mindset that people who look different than you amount to nothing was normal, so the discrimination did not stop. A parent will teach their child right and wrong, and then that child will teach their children what is right and wrong from what they were taught as children. It's a never-ending cycle. The way a person or certain group of people are talked about or treated in positive or negative light is determined by the generation beforehand. My father has once told me of a story when he was a child. He recounted to me about how his mother, who is Mexican, rented an apartment and she had taken along my uncle and my father. She was immediately accepted as a resident, and my family began to move into their new home. Then my grandfather came home. He was at work all day, so he was not there when my grandmother to sign the leasing for the apartment. My dad told me that once they saw my grandfather, who was black, the apartment owners immediately kicked out my family. They were expelled from the apartment simply because my grandfather was a black man. This was 50 years ago. It's easy to think that the discrimination that we hear about in school was a century ago, but in fact, most of the popular stories and the great civil rights leaders were fighting for our country only 50 years ago. The Jim Crow laws, the segregated facilities, the March at Salem, and the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X were all during our grandparents' and most of our parents' lifetimes. Racism is not only against black people, but against any person who is not of European descent. There have been many advances in our society since the freedom marches in the 60s, but we cannot forget that we are the first generation that has not been affected by racism in the extreme manner that was very popular not too long ago. But this does not dismiss the fact that people who run our country and are heads of our major corporations are children of this stigma. This past September, a head of a financial corporation said that their client, Rihanna, was hot because she is not too dark. In our reportedly progressive society, a person, and even more specifically a woman, is not beautiful unless she has a lighter pigment. Along with these statements, there have also been many killings that have not seemed to be justified in any way, including the deaths of Trayvon Martin and Eric Garner. The past 60 to 50 years in the United States have been very progressive in the severity of people of color being mistreated, but the underlying battle of racism in communities, in the media, and personal life is still very prominent. How different would our lives in our society be if race were not a factor in our everyday lives? Make an effort to put aside the programmed stereotypes and pre-made assumptions about people that we have based off of their race alone. Get to know a person. We are all the same. For once, let our races not define the preconceived notions of what we may become, but let our minds and our souls determine who we will be.